Well, hello. I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar. This is John Katazeski, the Director of the American Carbon Registry, and we hope with this webinar that we'll be able to provide all the participants with an update on the key elements of California's compliance market for carbon offsets. We're happy to talk about what is happening in this market because California has shown great leadership in launching a cap and trade market as one cornerstone of its historic climate change legislation. While California's legislation includes multiple actions aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state, we're going to concentrate today on the cap and trade component. Winrock believes the science clearly shows that humankind's activities are affecting global climate and that we need to take action as quickly as possible to reduce emissions and to adapt to the changes that are already occurring. We at Winrock's American Carbon Registry feel that market mechanisms are the most efficient way to achieve necessary emission reductions, and we're committed to do whatever we can to make the California cap and trade market a success. Over the past year and a half, we have worked with ARB as they have developed their program. We've provided regular comments as ARB has established the rules and requirements for third-party offset project registries, and we've submitted several new offset protocols for consideration by ARB, including methodologies for reducing fugitive methane emissions from the natural gas sector and for reducing emissions by improving agricultural practices. Over the next few months, we will be opening a California office and hiring a California director. We want cap and trade in California to be a success so it can serve as a model for other jurisdictions around the world. Today we have two speakers for our webinar. The first will be Nick Martin from the American Carbon Registry, and the second will be Rajinder Sahota from the Air Resources Board. We know that there are going to be many questions, and so we've allocated more than 30 minutes from this webinar to answer questions that you might have. To ask questions of our presenters, please use the chat box that's located toward the bottom of your control panel. We'll answer as many of the questions that you have as time permits. If we run out of time, we'll try to follow up directly with you on any other questions that you might have that we are able to answer. And so without further delay, our first speaker will be Nick Martin. Nick is the Chief Technical Officer for the American Carbon Registry, and he's responsible for ensuring that the environmental integrity of all ACR registered projects and issued offsets is high. In addition to overseeing the development of new offset methodologies and protocols for ACR, Nick also runs ACR's certification of projects, the offset verification process, and the issuance of serialized offsets on our registry. He has been actively involved in the development of a number of different methodologies, including some in the oil and gas sector, transport sector, forest carbon, RED, agriculture, where we've been very active recently, livestock, both manure management and grazing land management, wetland restoration, as well as other areas. He's also involved in road testing some of the agricultural methodologies in the state of California to ensure that these not only produce valid offsets but are workable and attractive to the producers and users in the state. Before coming to American Carbon Registry, Nick worked for Xcel Energy, a large utility in the central part of the country, where he led the analysis of federal climate legislation, did work on biomass fuel supply, and developed the pre-compliance carbon offset pilot program for Xcel in the state of Colorado. He has a background in forest management and energy with an MS in energy and resources from the University of California at Berkeley. Nick, please go ahead.
Great, John. Thanks very much for the intro. What I want to do is spend just 10 or 12 minutes to give a sense of some of ACR's activities relevant to the California market, and then we'll hand off to Rajinder to tell us more about that market and about the regulation. I'm going to start with very briefly about ACR. I know there may be some people on the line who are less familiar. The American Carbon Registry was founded in 1996 by the Environmental Resources Trust, the first U.S. greenhouse gas registry. Since that time, we've issued about 32 million tons of verified emission reductions, which we call ERTs, emission reduction tons. In 2011, just as sort of a recap of that year, about just a little under 3 million tons sold, retired, and contracted on ACR at an average price of $5.51. So with a broad range, that range of price varies by offset project type, vintage, other factors. Our goals as a registry are basically we want to, as John said, viewing climate change as a very serious problem. We want to mobilize markets for the really transformative greenhouse gas reductions, the areas where we know there's big potential, but perhaps a methodology gap that can help create real reductions. Second, we want to focus on things that can further Winrock's global mission. I'll say something in a minute about our parent nonprofit, Winrock International, but that mission relates to sustainable natural resource management and economic development, poverty alleviation around the globe. And thirdly, we want to sort of help create the infrastructure to support voluntary and compliance market development. And we're going to be focusing today mainly on actions that we've been taking to try to help to support the market in California. As a registry, ACR is very similar to other similar programs that are out there. We have 4 basic roles: developing and improving offset protocols, doing a fairly detailed review of every project that comes to us and registering projects, overseeing the process of independent third-party validation and verification that is required for all projects, and then providing transparent tracking of all transactions and retirements. As I mentioned, ACR is part of a parent nonprofit called Winrock International that has been around for a little more than 25 years and had some predecessor organizations in the Rockefeller family tradition going back to the 1950s. I have the Winrock mission there on the screen. Currently, Winrock has projects in a little over 60 countries with about 840 staff worldwide, $100 million annual budget. So Winrock is a much larger organization, and parts of Winrock are very focused on having strong technical expertise on staff in areas such as reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, writing a lot of protocols for that for various partners. Agriculture, livestock, and grazing, that's been a Winrock focus since its founding. Renewable and clean energy worldwide, and biofuels, a big focus on biofuels and biofuel sustainability, and finally climate change. So we have one of the real advantages ACR has is a lot of bench strength to pull on in those areas from the larger Winrock International universe. I want to say a little bit about Winrock and ACR's work in California over the last 10 years or so. We developed carbon baselines and carbon sequestration, or what was called carbon supply curves, for California's agriculture, forests, and rangelands. That was work done in multiple studies for the California Energy Commission. We helped CAL FIRE prepare their estimates of 5 different forestry practices that became part of the climate action team process. We implemented the terrestrial sequestration component of a project called WestCarb, the West Coast Regional Sequestration Partnership, and that project was included looking at some activities with potential for sequestration statewide, as well as implementing pilot projects in Northern California, Shasta County, in things like reforestation, forest conservation, biomass energy, sort of some of the earlier work that informed many of the activities that are being considered now. We were one of the authors of the earliest California Climate Action Registry Forestry Protocol. That's, of course, gone through multiple versions since then. We worked to develop an ACR livestock manure management project standard, working with the Energy Commission, South Coast Air Quality Management District, and some other stakeholders. Interesting protocol that looks at the greenhouse gas reductions, but also air quality potential improvements from particulate matter reductions. And now we've been working with the Air Resources Board on a couple of activities that I'll feature here in the next slide. Our work over the past, I'd say, since mid to late 2010 with the Air Resources Board falls into, I think, 3 categories. We've provided our inputs to ARB on the draft rule, both from when it was released in December of 2010 and through the first and second sets of 15-day changes, basically just ideas that hopefully help in the design of a smoothly functioning offset market. All of us want to make sure that the offset market works well, works cost effectively, and delivers the cost containment benefits that we know offsets can provide if done properly. Secondly, we've been speaking with the Air Resources Board about a few ACR protocols that are being considered by ARB as the basis on which they could build additional compliance and or early action offset protocols. John mentioned pneumatic controllers in the oil and gas sector, agriculture, fertilizer management, and rice. I'll say just a little bit about each of those protocols. Those, of course, would ultimately be ARB, not ACR protocols, compliance offset protocols. Thirdly, we are planning to apply, hoping to be approved as one of the ARB's designated offset project registries. We have not been approved as yet, want to make that clear, but ARB expects to approve some registries in the next couple of months. In the regulation, the function of those registries is basically to assist ARB in implementing the offset program, because ACR and other programs have experience over the past few years in reviewing, registering, and tracking offset projects in the voluntary market. The Air Resources Board wants to try to build on that experience, so plans to approve one or more offset project registries. At that point, projects developed under any of the compliance offset protocols, which include 4 currently and may include others in the future, those projects can register on an offset project registry. The role of the offset project registry will be to help address protocol questions, provide technical oversight of all projects that come in, so review all the documentation, oversee the verification process, which will be by ARB accredited verifiers, and ultimately issue serialized what's called registry offset credits to those projects. Now, ARB will ultimately retain control of any and all offset credits that are eligible to use for compliance. So the process described in the regulation is initial review and leading up to issuance of registry offset credits by these OPRs, but ultimately when ARB issues offset credits on its own registry, the same number of serialized registry offset credits would be canceled as are created by ARB. So I have just very brief slides on these protocols. I think it's hard to summarize a whole protocol briefly, and I don't want to take too much time, but I thought it was useful to say a little bit about each. So a protocol that ACR published in 2010 is called Conversion of High to Low Bleed Pneumatic Controllers. This focuses on the controllers that are venting methane, currently venting methane at some tens or hundreds of thousands of individual devices on oil and gas producing facilities across the U.S. Very, geographically focused in certain regions, the Rocky Mountains and others. These are emitting an estimated around 19 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. They're devices that vent methane they're on facilities that have that are off-grid, have no local source of power. So the pressure from the natural gas that's being produced is used to perform some function, and the operating function, and those devices then are venting methane almost all of the time, except when they're actually performing that function. So there's an opportunity here to replace those with low or no bleed pneumatic controllers and get avoided reduced emissions of vented methane in a way that is clearly additional. It's not required by any regulation. It's not. It's demonstrated in this methodology to be not common practice in the industry based on very low adoption rates. It's also a very straightforward, clearly additional, precisely measured activity with no reversal risk, no leakage risk, and one that although this is small reductions at each individual facility, is easy to scale up pretty quickly and dramatically. The reduction potential, ARB has estimated at up to 15 or 20 million metric tons a year by the end of 2014. So this is an activity that would only be potentially eligible through the end of 2014 if ARB should approve a compliance protocol. There are so far 3 projects certified by ACR that over their crediting period expect to reduce a little over 2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Second protocol, ACR published in 2010, late 2010, a protocol for nitrous oxide reductions through changes in fertilizer management. This is applicable to any modified fertilizer practice, so reducing fertilizer quantity or rate, but also changing timing, placement, type of fertilizer, using timed release fertilizer, nitrification inhibitors, etc. Anything that you can do in farming to improve nitrogen use efficiency by the plants, have more of the nitrogen applied be taken up by the plants rather than being lost either as nitrous oxide, a powerful greenhouse gas, or as nitrates to the groundwater, which is a water quality issue. This protocol can be used in any region or crop, but it has to be where the model on which it's based has been calibrated and validated properly. The model is called DNDC. It's a process-based model for calculating nitrous oxide emissions for the baseline and project scenario. This protocol is currently being tested in 3 different U.S. Department of Agriculture grants, as well as a project on tomatoes in California. I think these road testing sorts of projects are really useful because, you know, as good as a protocol may be, it's not really worth much until it's taken up by farmers. And for that to happen, we really need road tests and to help farmers learn the protocols, understand how they can be applied and what the financial benefits are. This project, in many of these USDA grants, the project developers are developing user interface tools to make data entry simpler for aggregators and farmers. And we're currently in the process of developing version 2 of this protocol, which will address such things as specifics around independent validation and the model uncertainty, getting a strong handle on that. The annual nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer across the United States are a little over 205 million metric tons per year, according to the US EPA greenhouse gas inventory. So under this protocol, although I want to emphasize that it'll take time to scale up, if you could get to sort of 10% reductions, you'd have 20 million metric tons per year of reductions, quite a significant number. That would, of course, require a lot of uptake by farmers around the U.S. Thirdly, there's a protocol for focusing on the rice sector developed by the Environmental Defense Fund, Terra Global Capital, California Rice Commission, and a company called DNDC Applications Research and Training. This has been submitted to ACR. It's gone through our public comment and peer review process, and that process is virtually finished for this protocol, which includes 3 practices: removing straw after harvest, which would reduce the amount of organic material available for the bacteria that produce methane; dry seeding, which reduces the length of the flooded season and potential methane emissions; and reductions in winter flooding, provided those can be those are quite limited in the protocol due to concerns of wanting to be able to maintain or enhance wildlife waterfowl habitat. This protocol is I mentioned it's virtually finished. We've held it back because we're now looking. We and the authors are now looking at a couple of additional practices, one for California, and also developing a module for the Mid-South. California is the 2nd largest rice state in the country. The largest is Arkansas, and there are a few other Mid-South states that have very significant rice cultivation. And the practices that are of interest to growers in the Mid-South include early drainage, intermittent flooding, staggered winter flooding, other measures that would reduce water and or diesel consumption. So one of the steps in this protocol will be to have a module for the Mid-South so that potentially additional supply could come in to California if the Air Resources Board were to adopt a rice protocol. I wanted to say just a bit about road testing. I talked before about how important road testing is for agricultural protocols. There are, I put briefly on here, I don't want to go into details, but there's 3 different USDA grants as well as work in California that are working to apply the ACR fertilizer protocol. The Delta Institute one is working in Illinois, Michigan, and Oklahoma with a large number of farmers, trying to aggregate farmers together to create fertilizer changes and nitrous oxide emission reductions. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation and some partners are working in the Chesapeake region to look at nitrous oxide emissions as well as reducing nitrate leaching to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The Fertilizer Institute and some partners are actually road testing not only the ACR fertilizer protocol, but another excellent protocol by Michigan State, as well as one from the Alberta offset system, to sort of compare results under those different protocols. And the California Farm Bureau, Environmental Defense Fund, UC Davis, and other partners are just beginning a project to road test this fertilizer protocol with a couple of California tomato growers in Yolo and Fresno counties. All of these projects are trying to learn lessons from applying protocols on the ground, developing user interface tools, and so on, that I think will be informative as the state of California goes forward on designing its own protocol in this area. Finally, the rice protocol that I talked about is also the subject of a USDA grant, which is pilot testing with rice growers in California as well as the Mid-South over the next couple of years. I wanted to mention also ACR is in a process of designing what we call nested red requirements. There's interest in the red world as well as a potential route in the California regulation for red credits that are developed within a jurisdictional accounting framework to become compliance credits in California. ACR has been engaged in an activity that is somewhat related to this, developing nested red requirements, which would be for project level activities, but those that are undertaken within a jurisdictional accounting framework. By jurisdiction, we mean national or subnational jurisdictions that are developing accounting frameworks, including baselines for red, monitoring, leakage requirements, ways to address reversal risk and non-performance. So we have taken sort of a stepwise approach to developing these requirements, where at first we're focusing still just on the project level activities. We are not sort of trying to develop for those jurisdictions how they should develop their baselines or monitoring or leakage, but we are setting the minimum criteria that those jurisdictional accounting frameworks would need to meet in order for project level activities to register on ACR. This work is led by Dr. Sandra Brown of Winrock International, and along with a group of eight sort of technical experts in red who are helping us develop the technical guidance. We are also limiting ourselves primarily to the technical and social requirements. There's a whole range of legal and linkage issues that are also related to, that will also need to be developed for red credits to flow into the California market. Those are being worked on by the GCF Red Offset Working Group, and we hope that our technical guidance, along with that of others who are working on jurisdictional red, will help complement the sort of legal and linkage issues that are also being developed by the Red Offset Working Group. We hope to release these first draft of these requirements in April or May this year. That'll be followed by the usual ACR stakeholder consultation, public comment, and peer review steps prior to approval. Finally, I just wanted to mention a few other ACR protocols. I won't talk about all those on the list here, but I did want to mention there are I think some additional protocols that, although they may be taken up later, could be relevant to the California market. Currently under review, we have a protocol for restoration of degraded deltaic wetlands that currently focuses on the Mississippi Delta. That protocol may be expanded to focus on wetlands, deltaic wetlands in California, so it's a relevant opportunity there, I think. And then we're doing a bit of work related to livestock emissions, both at the end of the livestock production cycle and the feedlot operations, various ways to reduce enteric methane and other sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and then also a project that will be developing a methodology to look at sort of integrated grazing land management in the earlier stages of the livestock production cycle to ways to implement grazing systems that improve, that enhance below-ground carbon sequestration, reduce emissions from enteric methane as well as manure methane, and possibly even reduce emissions, fertilizer emissions from feed production. So those are all issues that, although they'll take a little longer to develop, I think would also be relevant to California with its very significant livestock sector in the state. That's all I have in my presentation. I want to hand off now to Rajinder Sahota of the California Air Resources Board. Rajinder is currently the manager of the Market Monitoring Group at the Air Resources Board, tasked with market monitoring, offset policy, and linkages with the Western Climate Initiative. Earlier, over the past couple of years, Rajinder began as the lead manager on the offset program for ARB, but has been involved really in the development of the entire regulation. I don't know if there are many other people that know it back to front in the way Rajinder does. So we're very glad to have her, and she'll be excellent to answer any questions that folks may have in the Q&A period. Rajinder's position moving forward is now on market oversight, any new cap-and-trade rulemaking. She's very focused on the linkages with Quebec and the other WCI jurisdictions, Canadian provinces. And she is in charge of offset policy, both for the WCI and for California's process of adopting additional offset protocols. Rajinder has her degrees in both bachelor's and master's in atmospheric sciences from UC Davis. So we're very glad to have Rajinder on the line today to give you a summary of the regulation, offset policy, and linkages, and I'll hand over to her now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everybody. Before I begin, I would really like to thank the American Carbon Registry for the invitation and opportunity to speak today. As Nick had mentioned, ACR provided several rounds of comments to us during the rule finalization last year, and they provided helpful practical information on how we should design the offset program. And we're really looking forward to ACR applying to be an offset project registry under our regulation, and really believe that they will bring some healthy and well-experienced competition in providing registry services to offset project developers who use our compliance offset protocols. So for my presentation, I'm going to do a quick update on the cap-and-trade regulation, and then talk about the program overview. Under program overview, I'm going to answer a few questions that have come up recently, just so that we can start getting some of that new information out, not necessarily related to offsets, and then discuss the offset program and a quick summary on the linkage efforts that are currently underway, and then next steps with some timing. So as most people know, the cap-and-trade regulation was subject to board approval in December of 2010. The board adopted the final regulation order in October of 2011, and the cap-and-trade regulation became effective January 1 of this year. Included in the regulation were the 4 compliance offset protocols, so those are also currently in effect and can be picked up and used to generate offsets. I think it might be helpful to provide a quick overview of the cap-and-trade program. So the cap is the aggregate limit on GHG emissions from covered sources from 2013 through 2020. The cap applies to all the combined sources, and there are no individual caps for facilities, so there's no maximum that a facility has to remain below each year. The cap covers 85% of California's greenhouse gas emissions once all the sources are brought under it beginning in the second compliance period. And that includes large industrial sources, and these are entities that emit over 25,000 metric tons of CO2e per year, electricity generation and imports, the transportation fuels beginning in 2015, and residential and commercial use of natural gas beginning in 2015. Some of the questions that have been coming up recently have been related to the market itself. And, what has ARB done to design the program to ensure market integrity? Well, all traders must register in the cap and trade tracking system, and that's called KITS. This includes all offset project operators. And the tracking system provides a chain of custody for all allowances and offsets that will be issued by ARB. Each of these compliance instruments will have a unique serial number so that we can always track the history and current holder of each compliance instrument in the system. We have also developed purchase and holding limits to limit the ability of any participant to corner the market. And of course, we recognize the need to balance the need for transparency and safeguards to prevent market manipulation. So as part of implementing the program, there will be certain amounts of data that we will make publicly available so that people understand what's happening with the prices, what's happening with the compliance instruments, what volumes are exchanging hands, but also making sure that we don't give away any confidential or market-sensitive information for the covered entities or the offset project operators. So how will ARB ensure compliance and enforce the regulation? There are strict registration, reporting, and third-party verification requirements. These requirements extend from covered entities to offset project developers. The program enforcement rules are designed to encourage compliance. We have the ability to assess financial and criminal penalties under the Health and Safety Code statutes that ARB can operate under. Specifically for covered entities, they must surrender compliance instruments for 30% of their annual emissions each year beginning in 2013. And that requirement is established so that after a 3-year compliance period, an entity, a covered entity, can't turn around and say that they hadn't planned well enough or that they aren't positioned to purchase and surrender the amount of compliance instruments that are due to cover the emissions for that compliance period. This incremental surrender of instruments is to make sure that they're doing their due diligence along the way during the compliance period. And included in those compliance instruments are offsets as well as allowances. So how will ARB monitor the program outcomes? Staff will monitor whether the program is meeting all objectives of AB 32 and not resulting in unanticipated outcomes. That includes tracking the compliance cost and tracking for leakage with our covered entities. We will also have an independent market surveillance committee that will monitor for evidence of market manipulation. This entity will be reviewing auction data and mining overall transactions data for suspicious patterns. Staff will have a report to the board on program status and implementation at least annually, and that will also allow for public comment on the materials presented. And we are committed to conducting rulemaking prior to each compliance period if adjustments are needed in the program to make sure that the environmental goals and cost goals are being adhered to during the implementation of the program. Through all of this, ARB staff will also be actively involved in direct review of all market-related data. So specifically on the offset program, most of you are well aware that entities may use up to 8% offsets for compliance in the cap and trade program. There are a couple of sources of compliance offsets. The first is the issuance of offsets by the California Air Resources Board. And as a regulatory body, only ARB can issue any compliance instruments, and that includes both allowances and offsets. We could also allow for offsets issued by a linked regulatory program to be fungible in our system. An example of that would be when our board looks at consideration of linking to Quebec. So during that rulemaking in our regulation, we could specify that California will accept Quebec-issued allowances for purposes of compliance with our program. And then there are also the sector-based credits. An example of that is RED. But both the regulatory programs, such as the Western Climate Initiative and then RED, those are currently not in our system, and we would have to do future rulemakings to make it possible for those to be accepted for compliance in our system. And I'll talk a little bit about our current efforts on linkage in a little bit. So in ARB's program, there are several design features that must be met by offsets to ensure the environmental integrity of the program. Specifically, reductions must meet AB 32 criteria, and those are that they be real, additional, quantifiable, permanent, verifiable, and enforceable. And in terms of being additional, AB 32 is clear that they must be beyond what is required by regulation or would otherwise occur in a conservative business as usual setting. And offsets must result from ARB board-adopted compliance offset protocols. The protocols themselves are considered regulatory documents, and so no other public process or adoption process can be substituted for ARB's rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedure Act. Offset credits can also not be issued for greenhouse gas emission activities under the cap. One of the questions that we often get is, can I get offsets for an energy efficiency project? All energy, such as fuel and electricity generation, are covered sources under the cap, and so therefore we would not issue offsets for those types of projects or for the sources of emissions that are subject to a compliance obligation. It is really important for us to have a careful and sound rollout of our offset program. This area has been subject to a lot of scrutiny and continues to be subject to scrutiny, and we want to make sure that as we roll out the offset program, we do it in a very deliberate way that ensures that the environmental integrity is always intact and that we can withstand any type of scrutiny. There's been a lot of suspicion and there's been a lot of concern because of some of the issues that have come up in other regulatory programs such as the CDM, and we feel like we've designed our program and we will be implementing our program in a way to avoid some of the issues that presented themselves in that program. So in our regulation, there's a general process for issuance of offset credits. Step one is that our board would approve an offset protocol, a compliance offset protocol. Next, an offset project developer would submit project-related information as a listing step. Then there would be annual monitoring and reporting for offset projects, and then third-party verification of the quantified reductions or sequestered carbon. And then ultimately, at the end of this process, there is the ARB offset credit issuance. Steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 can be done through an approved offset project registry, and we will be relying on offset project registries to help us implement the program in some of these administrative features so that we're not duplicating efforts within our own agency, and also because we want to leverage the experiences and the systems that the registries already have in place. The registries, and this is something Nick had mentioned, can also issue registry offsets for these protocols and these projects. But those registry offsets themselves cannot be used in ARB's program. Only ARB can issue credits in its own tracking system that can be used for offset or for compliance. So what would happen is the registry would issue registry offsets. ARB would review all of the project documentation. And if ARB agrees that all of the offset project-related documentation meets all the requirements of the regulation and that there has been a positive verification opinion associated with that reported emission reduction or sequestration of carbon, then ARB itself would issue its own ARB offset credits for those emission reductions, and then the registry would cancel the equivalent registry credits in its own system. There is no direct transfer of any of the credits from our registry system to ARB system. Our instrument tracking system will be a standalone platform, and having any kind of open ports with other systems would pose a security issue for us. And again, as only ARB can issue a compliance instrument such as offsets, there really is no need to have direct transfer of any offsets issued by registries into our system. So an area that garners a lot of attention is offset and validation. We feel that this is a key piece of ensuring environmental integrity in the program. If an offset used for compliance and it is surrendered and is later found to be invalid, the entity that used it must replace it with another compliance instrument. So that means that the entity can replace it with an allowance or another valid offset credit. There is an 8-year statute of limitation on invalidation, which begins from the date of issuance by ARB. An offset project reviewed by a second verifier within 3 years can shorten that statute of limitation to 3 years from date of issuance. There is also a stepwise process before invalidation where additional information can be provided before a final decision is made by ARB on whether or not to invalidate offset credits. There's a lot more information about this in the regulation in section 95985, and we're happy to answer questions if you have questions on that area. The other key thing about the offset invalidation is that each offset credit will have a unique serial number so that we can block transfers or list the blocks of offset credits that may be subject to invalidation or are currently under review to help to prevent somebody from unknowingly purchasing offsets that are questionable at that time. And this was a feature that was added into the regulation during some of the last 15-day changes in order to prevent people from trying to sell away some offset credits that might have some potential issues or may be subject to invalidation. Okay. So key to the offset program is compliance offset protocols. ARB has adopted 4 compliance offset protocols to date. Those include forestry, urban forestry, ozone-depleting substances, and those are for substances sourced within the U.S. and destroyed within the U.S., and livestock digesters. These 4 protocols were originally developed for the voluntary offset market. Staff at ARB modified the protocols to make them consistent with the requirements in our regulation, consistent with the requirements in AB 32, and to make sure that they were consistent with the requirements of our rulemaking documents under the Administrative Procedures Act. And like I mentioned before, compliance offset protocols are considered regulatory documents. And for the most part, for us to update or change anything in the protocols, we would have to do a rulemaking activity and then have our board approve those changes. One area that we get a lot of questions on is future protocol development. We are currently coordinating with our WCI partners to establish a WCI priority protocol list so that we can identify and share with the public project types in which we have a lot of interest as a WCI regional program. That does not mean that once that list comes out that if ARB's 4 protocols aren't on it, that those are no longer valid. ARB can still adopt its 4 protocols, keep its 4 protocols, and adopt others. But in coordinating, it's really important for us to make sure that our partners feel comfortable with any new protocols we take forward and that we make some decisions after careful discussion so that the offsets generated under any protocols are fungible throughout a linked program. So with these new protocols, we can develop those internally or we can develop those under contract. For ARB, every protocol must be approved by the board after a stakeholder process, which would include a full public process, public comment period, through the formal drafting of comments and also in front of our board. One area that I wanted to talk about for compliance offset protocols is the agricultural protocols. In August of 2011, we did announce our intent to evaluate the rice cultivation and nutrient management protocols. For ARB, it's really critical for us to have accurate region and crop-specific data to understand model uncertainty and support quantification of reductions under each protocol. ARB has always prided itself on policy and regulations based on sound science, and that's something that we will further ensure in our offset protocols. I know Nick talked a little bit about each of these areas, so I don't want to spend too much time on them. But on the rice cultivation protocol, we are interested in waiting data for expanding the applicability of that protocol outside of California. We want to be able to review the data and make sure that the model is calibrated in a way that we can accurately account for any uncertainty in the model. Once we have the data and we have an opportunity to review that, we can figure out if we need additional information and work with some of the folks that have been acting and implementing pilot projects to see if we can get some of that additional information to make sure that there's a way to move forward with that RICE protocol. On the nutrient management protocols, ARB has been funding some studies to validate crops and regions in California, tomatoes being the largest crop type for California that's under research and review right now. Data is expected to be available beginning summer of 2012, so I know our research division is eagerly awaiting those results. And again, for the ag protocols, what's really critical for us is to just make sure we have solid scientific data to make sure that we can quantify types of reductions that are taking place in a way that is conservative and that represents real greenhouse gas reductions. Our chair has made several statements about our commitment to trying to get the ag sector involved in the program, and we're still committed to that, and we just are eager to get the data just as anybody else is. So, I would like to commend ACR for their efforts in looking at some of these studies and especially trying to calibrate a model that underlies so many of the agricultural-based protocols. Okay. So a key element of California's offset program is verification. AB 32 explicitly requires regulatory verification for all reductions used for compliance, and this includes any credits issued for compliance offset protocols or for early action that's been generated under previous versions of the compliance offset protocols. The regulations, third-party verification requirements, are based on ISO standards. The offset verification program is an expansion of our mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program, which also has a verification program. And to ensure some rigor in the verification program, we did add in some very strict conflict of interest requirements. And those requirements are based in existing regulations and laws for financial auditing conflict of interest and some other key provisions that staff felt would be important, such as relationship length between an offset project developer and a verifier. So ARB will accredit its own third-party offset verifiers. The verifiers will undergo protocol-specific training, and they must demonstrate knowledge of each offset project type by taking an exam and achieving a passing score. The other key part of the offset program is the voluntary offset project registries. Examples of these registries are the American Carbon Registry, the Climate Action Reserve, and the Verified Carbon Standard. None of these registries has any formal relationship or regulatory relationship with the state of California. They cannot adopt compliance offset protocols on behalf of ARB, and they cannot issue compliance offset credits that can be used in our system. But we do see a lot of value in these entities in helping ARB administer parts of the compliance offset program, and we're really happy that several of these entities, especially ACR, have expressed interest in applying to be an offset project registry under our program. So there is an update on the timing for offset verifiers and for approving registries. ARB has officially awarded the training, development, and delivery contract to an entity called Future Perfect. This is a group based out of Europe that has done offset training for other programs, and they've done training for ARB before. The contract remains to be executed in the next 2 weeks or so, but we plan to offer training in spring. Again, the training will be multiple-day training with exams. Offset verifiers will not have to take training for all project types, so verifiers may choose to specialize in one area and not all 4 areas, depending on their background and interests. And there will also be a module for registry staff to learn about their role under our program, and that would support us approving any offset project registries. So more information about that will be provided as we get a clearer vision of the timeline for providing that training. If you're interested, I would suggest that you sign up for the Cap and Trade listserv on our website. All information related to the Cap and Trade program will be sent to the public through that listserv. So recognizing early action offsets, these are credits that have been generated for protocols that are project types for previous versions of the 4 protocols that we have currently adopted. There's a new crediting period that begins for projects that transition from those early action protocols to the compliance protocol. So there is a strong incentive to transition those projects. And there is a very lengthy laid out process for how those credits would be reviewed, subject to verification, and then reissued ARB credits in our program with the retirement of the early action credits in the early action programs. So some of the key criteria for these early action credits is that the project must be located in the U.S. The early action program, the project itself must be registered with the early action program by January 1, 2014. And an early action program is a program that has existing credits for those 4 protocols, and that program has liability insurance, meets the requirements to be an Offset Project Registry, and has a publicly available website where information about those early action credits can be seen by the public. The vintages of those reductions must be between 2005 and 2014, so the early action program is very limited in its temporal scope. And again, the project types must be for which ARB goes on to adopt a compliance offset protocol. Like I mentioned before, we would look at early action credits for the 4 compliance project types that we've already adopted. But if ARB were to move forward with a RICE protocol, the Pneumatics protocol, or another type of protocol, then any existing credits under the voluntary versions of those protocols would also be eligible for review and evaluation for issuance of early action credit under our program. So I have one slide on sector-based offsets. We do have a framework established for accepting sector-based offsets from developing countries. Our regulation at this time does not include any approved sectors or programs. On red, we are awaiting recommendations from the offset working group. The adopted resolution clarifies a sublimit on the use of sector-based offsets for compliance. So in the first and second compliance periods, no more than 2% of an entity's compliance obligation can come from sector-based credits. And in the third compliance period, no more than 4% of an entity's compliance obligation can come from sector-based credits. We would have to initiate a new rulemaking to add in any sector-based credits. At this time, we don't have any specific program identified in our regulations. So one question we often get asked is, when can I implement a compliance offset project? Well, you can, as project developers, you can take one of our 4 protocols and implement the project now. We have the forestry, urban forestry, digester, and ODS protocols out there. You don't have to wait for a registry approval or verifier accreditation before implementing a project. The timing works out that if we can approve our registries and verifiers in the next 6 to 8 months, the project could begin as soon as tomorrow, or they could have begun a month or 2 months ago. And you can collect that data offline from the registries and then submit it once those registries are approved. So I would encourage offset project developers that are out there that may have been waiting for some reason to really get going with some of these projects and using our protocols. One benefit to using our protocols is that you don't have to go through the early action process anymore. You can initiate the project under our compliance offset protocol, collect the data, and then you would just take it through the regulatory verification as in section 95977 of our regulation. The early action credits, those are issued after verification by the registry process, but then they are again required to be verified by an ARB accredited verifier, which means at least a desk review and then potentially an on-site visit with a full verification process under our regulation. So you can save yourself some of that step by just going straight to the compliance offset projects starting now. And I can answer any more specific questions on that during the Q&A. I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about WCI linkage. Most folks know that we had our first workshop and initiated the linkage process last month with an initial discussion of areas that would be subject to review as part of linkage. So we are looking at least 2 rulemaking activities for this year. The first one is to consider accepting Quebec's cap-and-trade compliance instruments, and that's both offsets and allowances. And that would be a June board item. That's the process that we kicked off with the February workshop this year. The second rulemaking process is to address other board direction, minor clarifications, and new offset protocols, and that would be going to the board for consideration in fall of this year. So just to give you some background on the Western Climate Initiative, WCI was founded in 2007. It had broad goals of developing a regional target for greenhouse gas reductions, establishing a multi-state registry to track greenhouse gas emissions, developing a design for market-based programs to reach the regional GHG emissions target, and promote the development and use of clean and renewable energy and increase efficiency of energy use. California has been active in each of those areas within the state, and we're also collaborating with our WCA partners on each of those areas in the broader sense as well. An example of that is the LCFS. So the current status of WCI is that there is a focus on market-based programs by California, Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, and Manitoba. There was a nonprofit corporation, WCI Inc., established in November 2011. WCI Inc. will provide administrative and technical support to the participating jurisdictions, and that means that there has been no delegation of regulatory authority, program oversight, or policy making to this nonprofit organization. As regulatory agencies, ARB does not want to, nor can it give away those responsibilities to a nonprofit such as WCI Inc. There are also broader efforts that other states are involved in, including California, and that effort is referred to as North America 2050. And that group is looking at other mechanisms to address climate change mitigation beyond just a market-based program. So like I mentioned before, ARB must complete a new rulemaking to accept compliance instruments from a partner such as Quebec. That review process means looking at the final program that Quebec will draft into regulation in these current months. That includes a public stakeholder process subject to the Administrative Procedure Act, which means informal and formal comments written and to our board. And then a final board consideration of revisions to ARB's cap-and-trade regulation to allow for linkage and acceptance of Quebec's instruments. So like I mentioned, California and Quebec are in many discussions and in ongoing efforts to harmonize our programs. Harmonization is going to be required in the areas of reporting and the cap-and-trade program design. We need to harmonize our tracking system requirements and market policies and mechanics. When we talk about market policies and mechanics, those are areas such as holding limits, purchase limits, auction mechanics, and just transfers and trading in general. So looking forward for our offset program, we are going to be having an early action webinar in March. We do know that there have been several areas that folks have been calling us to get clarification on the early action process, and so we're going to respond to that with a webinar. We will be releasing a regulation guidance document and guidance documents for our protocols. We will also be developing offset program-related forms, and these are forms for project listing and reporting that we will make available to the registries. We will be conducting verifier and registry staff training, approving the Offset Project Registries, and accrediting our offset verifiers. On linkage, we will be releasing discussion drafts of linkage regulation text in the early spring, and I would consider that in the next couple of weeks. We will have additional public workshops. In May, we will issue a notice of proposed linkage regulation and our initial statement of reasons. And then our board will consider the linkage regulation in June of this year. For additional information about the program, you can visit our program webpage and also join our cap and trade listserv. Because this is a market program and we believe transparency is really important in the program, we are trying to limit the amount of different listservs that folks need to sign up for. And by signing up for the cap and trade listserv, you essentially guarantee that you will get all of the information related to the cap and trade program without having to worry about signing up for other listservs that have been disaggregated out of the program. And with that, I will conclude my part of the presentation.
Thanks very much, Rajinder. And this is John Katazeski back again to moderate the question and answer session. And we have quite, as you might expect, a long list of questions. And so I'll go through some of these. I guess the first one pertains to the linkage with Quebec and whether or not, if such a linkage is successfully occurs, whether that means that the California system would be open to projects in the United States and Canada as opposed to only in the United States. I guess that's a question for you, Rajinder.
So the way we see it is that upon program review and board consideration of the linkage regulation, all instruments issued by Quebec and California would be fungible in both programs. And so California at this time hasn't got protocols that would allow us to issue in Canada. We know that Quebec is working on a draft regulation for its own offset program. And if Quebec issues credits in Canada under its own regulation, those would be fungible in our program as well. So there's a nuance there. There's accepting offsets from Canada issued through Quebec versus California issuing in Quebec or Canada.
I guess maybe part of the question is whether or not you envision that Quebec would accept approved compliance methodologies from California and adapt them for use in Canada, or whether that would be not likely to occur.
I do know that they are looking at some of our compliance offset protocols, and as part of their offset regulation and their revisions to their cap and trade program, they will be proposing a couple of compliance protocols under which they would issue. They haven't made that information public yet, and so I don't feel like I can share that until they've approved sharing it. But yes, you should expect Quebec to have some compliance offset protocols.
A quick comment. We've had a number of questions about the availability of the slides and the audio presentation, and so those will be available through the ACR website. And so anyone that wants them, they could be up as soon as later today, but realistically within the next couple of days they'll be available at the website. So if you're interested in any of the slides or the audio, you can find that there. I guess a second question here, this is also for you, Rajinder. What's the point of having several registries? Why can't there just be one registry for all offset projects in the United States?
So we had a lot of discussion about what to do about implementing the offset program when we were writing the original regulation in 2010. And what we realized was that there were already multiple registries out there. As you guys indicated, ACR has been one of the longest running registries, and then there's also VCS, and then there's the Climate Action Reserve. We as a state can't pick one particular registry and designate it as the portal to bring projects to our compliance offset program because we have no say over the fees. And so what we thought we'd do is in the spirit of a true market program, have competition between registries, but set the bar really high for who could apply as a registry. And that way offset project developers have a choice between registries that they use to bring their products to the compliance market. And yet the registries would have to have competitive fee structures and provide services that would enhance the services that they provide to bring in offset project developers to them as a business.
This is a question on the early action projects transitioning to ARB, and I think you've answered this. The question came in, during your presentation. I think you've answered it, but there might be some nuance here that wasn't directly addressed in your presentation. So the question asks whether or not how the initial crediting period will be considered. So if a project has a 10-year crediting period under CAR and then it transitions to ARB, how will ARB's crediting period be set? Will it be set?
I'm sorry, John, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, will it be set? Will it be 10 years from the start of yours, or will the first couple of years of eligibility be lost if it was reported under a different registry?
No, you start with a new crediting period under the ARB protocol.
That seems clear. Now a question on the, and I'm not sure, maybe this might be partially you, Nick, but I think it's really a Rajinder question. Why would the crediting period for the pneumatics methodologies end in 2014 and not continue on for the rest of the California compliance time?
So from our perspective, those sources of emissions are capped beginning in 2014. And so keeping with the program design where we don't issue offsets for capped sources, we would have to cut off eligibility for offsets at that point in time.
So that would mean that if for some reason the consideration of the cap was delayed for a year or two past the 2015 announced date, then that crediting period might be extended.
That's correct. As long as there's no other reason, like no regulatory need to switch out those systems, et cetera, as long as they're still additional.
Who initiates the invalidation process? Does this require a challenge to come from a specific party, or is that something that could be initiated by ARB on its own behalf?
It could be initiated by ARB on its own if we find some reason for discrepancies in documentation, or we come to realize that maybe the verifier or the project developer has other issues with other projects that would cast suspicion on anything that we've issued for their project type. The other key part of the offset program is that because it has been subject to scrutiny, we want to make the offset program as transparent as possible. So we will be making available project-related information, the verification statements. And so if there are members of the public that have some other information or have some other reason to doubt or question why ARB issued compliance offset credits, those members of the public can initiate that process by coming to ARB, having us review or look into the cause of those concerns, which may or may not lead to us going down the path of invalidation, but we have to make that available to everyone as part of program transparency.
Now a couple of questions around the red topic. You referred to the governor's Climate and Forest Task Force as providing some guidance, but do you have any sense of the timing for that guidance from them? And in the initial conversations that have gone on, a lot of the discussion has been around the agreement that California has with Acre in Brazil and Chiapas in Mexico and a province in Indonesia. Will the focus of any initial red activities be in those jurisdictions, or could they come from anywhere?
So my understanding is that we should be getting those recommendations early this year. And I know that at least one of our staff has been sitting in on those meetings as an observer, and that Acre and Chiapas representatives have been in those discussions as well. Obviously, since we have formal agreements with those two jurisdictions, and discussion has occurred with them in the room on the row, there's going to be more upfront work and more preparation already done, but that does not close the door on looking at other areas for RED projects or inclusion of RED as the recommendations are reviewed and we make some policy determinations in-house.
So realistically, you think that RED projects might be able to be accepted, is there like a year, would you say 2015, 2016, or is it really hard to say?
It's really hard to say. I've sat in on some of those discussions. The group is grappling with some really tough questions related to data availability for verification of sector targets, for monitoring and verification. And I think Nick alluded to this, there's some social considerations with some of the RED projects. It's not just about the science. And so, we're really interested in seeing what this group of experts has to say on some of these very tough questions. And until we see that and we've had a chance to digest that, I feel like it would be premature for me to try and put a date on it.
Here's a clarification question on third-party verification. Will ARB be accepting verifiers that have completed CAR training for third-party verification?
No, ARB has its own process for accrediting its verifiers.
A lot of questions on whether or not ARB is planning to consider any other protocols besides the 3 that were announced at the August 2011 board meeting, and what the timing might be for those other protocols.
Sure. We are looking at other project types for consideration. We consider a lot of the information related to what new protocols we're going to move forward with as market-sensitive information, because there's been this tendency that once we make an announcement, people run and invest in certain things. And so we try to be very careful in what we say so that we don't give false signals anywhere. But I can confirm that we are looking at other project types beyond the 3 that were announced last August.
Great. And I guess in a related question, do you anticipate that there will be any concessions to allow early action offsets from protocols that ARB does not adopt for compliance? And I guess this one's really specifically looking at things like landfill gas, where ARB will not adopt one for compliance, but will there be any concessions to allow early action offsets from those protocols?
Right now, the policy decision is not to allow early action credits for project types for which we would not adopt a compliance offset protocol.
Okay. Do you anticipate any linkage with CDM? Is ARB planning to allow the use of offsets issued under Clean Development Mechanism?
Not right now. I mentioned during my presentation that there's been a lot of scrutiny of our offset program. There's a lot of questions related to CDM because of some of the stories that have come out about CDM. And what we want to focus on is making sure that we can get it right with our own compliance offset program for which we issue, and making sure that any jurisdictions with which we link to, they also have rigorous methods and processes for issuing offset credits. And once we feel comfortable with that, we would consider looking at other programs for accepting their offsets.
This is a Quebec question, which you may not have any information on, but the question is whether or not you anticipate that Quebec will separately approve third-party registries for use in its system and then use a similar process to what California has for approving their third-party registries.
I can honestly say that I have not seen Quebec's offset regulation, so I actually don't know the answer to that.
Here's another one. Can you comment on any differences regarding invalidation provisions between forest credits in particular and other credits? Or are these all going to be treated the same as far as invalidation?
No, they are treated a little bit separately in a couple of cases, only because in forestry projects, the physical custody of the carbon stocks, it remains with the project developer. And so there are some nuances in the reg that address forest credit invalidation a little bit differently. We do have a forest buffer account for unintentional reversals for forest credits, and then we have a separate process for intentional reversals. I don't want to get into all the details about how they're different, but yes, they are treated separately in our program.
And so invalidation provisions would also be separate in the same way?
Yes.
On the I guess this is a clarification question. I think you addressed it in your comments, but with respect to the agricultural offset methodologies that have been listed at the August 24th board meeting, for producers who implement pilot projects using those methodologies before compliance protocols are issued or approved, will they be eligible for early action consideration in the same way that others are?
Yes, absolutely. You know, we understand for a lot of these project types that, especially in the agricultural sector, there's this hurdle to getting people to participate and to actually take on new practices because of a fear of drop in yield of crops, et cetera. And so in keeping with the design of the early action program, if we move forward with the nutrient management protocol or when we move forward with the rice protocol, we would look at any of the credits issued under the pilot projects as evaluation for early action credits in our program.
Here's a question on the, and I think I know the answer to this one, but I think your answer is more authoritative. You know, if both ACR and CAR become approved registries, will ACR be able to facilitate development of projects using any of the ARB compliance protocols, even if they were originally developed as CAR protocols?
Yes.
And vice versa for CAR, will CAR be able to use any protocols that may have been originally developed by ACR?
Yes, that's the way it's supposed to work.
I guess here's a question from someone in Chiapas who acknowledges that there's a lot of unanswered, you know, questions, and that those won't be known in the near term. But I guess the question is whether or not the engagement with ARB will be through projects that would apply under a protocol, or whether they will have to be, you know, through the jurisdiction, through the state.
The sector targets definitely have to be monitored through the local jurisdictions, and how the mechanism is for actually issuing credits and who issues those, I think those are supposed to be part of the recommendations that are made to ARB. And so I probably am not well versed enough in the background of those discussions to provide a meaningful answer, but I know that options have come up for a third party that's operating in those jurisdictions to issue on behalf of those jurisdictions, or projects to apply directly to ARB for issuance in those jurisdictions, or for the jurisdiction itself to issue for projects within its own boundaries. And what the legal implications are and the enforceability are for each of those options, I know that the legal folks are looking into that as part of the offset working group. So I don't think I'm prepared to provide a definitive answer on that.
What happens to existing ARB-approved compliance protocols if the WCI participant in the future regulates that particular activity? Would that mean that it would become ineligible for all participating, you know, WCI jurisdictions, or would it be still independent action by individual participants, and a larger WCI framework might still honor those protocols?
So this issue has come up regarding, and I'll put it in the example of the landfill offsets. ARB regulates its landfills, and because we don't want to disadvantage landfills in a one jurisdiction versus another jurisdiction, the WCI policy is to not give offsets for a source that's regulated in a partner jurisdiction. So even as we move forward, if, let's say, somebody decides to regulate the forest and requires a certain amount of sequestration in the forest, then we would not be able to issue credits for those project types. So whether or not a jurisdiction decides to pursue regulations in some of the project type areas does affect all the other jurisdictions' ability to issue credits.
So, for example, right now, California's regulations on landfills would preclude landfills from being included in Quebec, you know, assuming that there was an agreement.
Correct.
Has there been any discussion regarding harmonization of third-party verifier requirements between California and Quebec?
We did. We spent a lot of time as just part of WCI looking at the design of the overall programs, and in the context of that, not specifically in the context of this current linkage discussion, the WCI jurisdictions have agreed that California's program is equivalent, at least equivalent to the minimum design requirements in the WCI documents. We don't think further harmonization is needed. And so Quebec will accept our verifiers as being to the same level of rigor for our purposes as if they were going to accept any other ISO accredited verifiers into their program. So they don't have to be the same. We just mutually agreed that they're equivalent.
Okay. I think that's clear, but if others have questions for greater clarification on that, please, you know, articulate the greater clarification you're seeking so I can frame it in a question. I guess there's a question about, you know, accounts for the third-party offset registry. Since the ultimate registry is the Air Resources Board registry, will buyers and sellers need to have accounts on both the third-party offset project registry and on ARB's registry?
The offset project operators, developers, they will definitely have to have accounts with the registry in which they're getting their projects listed and verified. And once they want to have those reductions issued ARB offset credits, those will be issued in the ARB registry. So they will have to have an account here. Now, if you're somebody that's on the market to buy offset credits, and you want to use them for compliance, you at minimum need an account on ARB's registry. If folks that are developing projects want to sell the pre-compliance credits that are issued by the registries but not issued by ARB, then their counterparties could have accounts on the registries. So it's not necessary for purchasers to have credits or accounts on the registry, on the voluntary registries, but it is critical for them to have an account in ARB's registry if they want to buy the ARB issued credits.
And here is a request from one of the participants to repeat the steps that can be done through that can be done through a third-party registry as opposed to directly on ARB's.
Sure. So you can implement a project, submit the listing information for that project to a registry, which will make that publicly available. You can collect the annual data and report that data to the registry, which will also make some of that data publicly available. And then you can hire a verifier, an ARB accredited verifier, and have the verification report and the verification statement submitted to the registry, which will review all of that information and identify any issues that are present with the information provided in the emissions data report and in the verification report. After that point, the registry, upon successful verification of the emission reductions, the registry can issue registry offset credits And then the offset project developer can submit all of the documentation with all of the legal attestation forms to ARB. ARB would then issue compliance credits, and the registry would cancel any of the registry credits for that same emission reduction report.
And so that linkage, the bringing of the project from the third-party offset registry to the ARB registry is done by the project proponent rather than...
That is correct. We also know that this is an area where offset project registries can offer additional services to offset project developers and help them collect all the forms and information that they need to submit to ARB and review all of that before it comes to ARB. But it has to be somebody has to submit all of that documentation to us before we can issue compliance credits for that project.
Any news about the involvement of any other WCI partners in the WCI initiative beyond Quebec?
The folks that I mentioned as being focused on the market program are still actively working on their regulations. And what we've all been discussing is that as soon as they have a regulation and a program in place, that we would then start looking at linking with other jurisdictions. I'm not sure what the specific timing is for some of those other jurisdictions, like Manitoba, British Columbia, and Ontario. I'm just aware that they're very active in our WCI market group, and that we really look forward to when they're ready with their program so that we can have a broader market.
But no sense of any specific timing from anybody? There's nobody that's getting close to jumping in?
Not that I'm aware of.
We have a question on the, if you have any estimates on the expected volume of offsets that should be available from the forestry protocols that are already approved.
From our forestry protocols, I think
yes.
For California issuing in the U.S., I think we had about 6 to 10 million metric tons in the U.S. For the 3 compliance periods. There's a slide on one of our presentations on our website from June of 2010 that has that information. We haven't updated any of our supply numbers publicly yet. So I think it's between 6 to 10 million.
And has any estimates been made of the likely contribution of red?
We've heard external estimates of red, and the external estimates that I've seen have been far in exceedance of what would be allowed in our program, because we do have that sector-based usage limit of 2% and then 4% in the 3rd compliance period. So I know that if at some point we started to accept red, there would be more than enough credits to meet our supply demand.
Okay. This is a clarification. I guess it's a follow-up on your WCI entrant. You know, if the WCI entrant regulates a project type at some point in time, then at the time of that regulation, that would halt all other WCI members from issuing previously valid offsets for future time periods? I'm not sure if I'm asking that question well, but let's say someone has an approved crediting period for 10 years for a particular project type, and in year 6, that becomes a regulated project type in one of the cooperating entities. Would that mean that the last 4 years of that project's eligibility would be lost, or would ARB honor the original crediting period but not allow any other projects to be approved under that methodology?
We are currently discussing that very issue, and I don't have a definitive answer on that. We recognize that the whole point of having an established crediting period is to provide some certainty to return on a project and its investment. I think it's an area that we need to discuss further with our WCI partners.
I think this is a red question. It's back to the question about other countries besides Brazil, Mexico, and Indonesia. I believe that you answered that you would expect that because there's been discussions already on Brazil, Mexico, and Indonesia, that those would be ahead in terms of being ready to be approved and satisfy all the requirements, but that it would be open to other projects from other regions. And so is that true, that you would anticipate sector projects would be open to projects from other regions besides Acre, Chiapas, and Kalimantan?
That would be true. Again, recognizing that there is a formal agreement between California and some of these other jurisdictions to work together on this issue. One thing that's been missing is, even with Chiapas and Acre, is what other additional formal agreement needs to be in place, and the legal staff is looking at that. And so before any jurisdiction could be accepted for generating sector-based credits, there's legal questions about how those agreements would look and who would actually sign those within those jurisdictions. So there's nothing to preclude any other jurisdiction from becoming part of the program. It's just, even in the context of the existing ones, what formal agreements need to be in place.
Okay, one last question, and I think we're out of time. Actually, we're probably out of time, but we'll do this one last question because I think it's an interesting one. Will offset purchases be open to anyone beyond regulated entities? So specifically entities that might want to purchase offsets under Clean Air Act tailoring rules, or speculators who are looking to buy low and sell high and profit from their ability to predict future demand and pricing.
So this is specifically on offsets.
Yes.
When we talk about holding limits and purchase limits in the context of the program, those are designed for allowances. There's no limits on speculators or even covered entities on how many offsets they can purchase from offset project developers. That's an area, because of the offset usage limit, we didn't feel like we needed to try and protect the position, the ability for somebody to position themselves in the offset market. If there's a problem, then we have the ability to adapt the program and address that. During the course of the rulemaking, that was not a problem that was articulated to us that we needed to address at the time.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time block, and I'd like to thank you very much for fielding all questions as you did. I know there are a number of questions that were asked that we didn't get a chance to raise during the Q&A period, and we will try to get back to people on those, at least those that we think weren't already answered as part of the questions, because some were very similar. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. I do hope we had several hundred participants in this webinar. I hope that's a sign that they feel that California's leadership in the cap and trade market is as important as we feel it is, and that we'll all be working together to help make that marketplace a success. So thank you very much. Again, you can find the slides and the audio tracks at the ACR website.